Okay, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you here bright and early. Probably you were partying last night, and will be tonight too. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's new in Galera Cluster 4. I am a consultant at Codeship, makers of Galera Cluster. Also do other stuff. Also before that, used to work in MySQL, MariaDB, as well as Percona. I have a fairly quick agenda today, so that you can have more time outside to also chit-chat and learn. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Galera Replication. I think some people walked in and said, what is Galera? So I've obviously overheard that, and you could totally figure out what that is. Some new features. Of course, the new features come to MariaDB Server 10.4, which just got released yesterday. I'm going to guess many of you did not know that. Who tried MariaDB 10.4 yesterday? Exactly. I know the press release must have come out some weeks ago, but it actually did land yesterday. So Codeship, the original makers of Galera Cluster, multi-master virtually synchronous replication solution for the MySQL ecosystem. It is not the only virtually synchronous replication solution for the MySQL ecosystem. If you use Percona HDB cluster or MariaDB Galera cluster, you obviously benefit from the work that's being done at Codeship. There is a booth. You can win some kind of gift. I'm not sure what it is, but there is a slide at the back for that later. Of course, beyond engineering, Codeship also offers 24/7 support, training, consulting, and a whole lot more. So visit the booth and talk to them. Codeship also sponsors this event. So Codeship, the developers and experts behind Galera Cluster, it's been around since 2007. There was a first release of MariaDB with Galera Cluster around the 5.5 mark, maybe in about 2011. It's founded by 3 people, Seppo, Timu, Alex. Full-on services business model, producing 100% open source software. It's got thousands of users in various industries, so it's been around for a long time. Lots of people use it. Galera is largely just a generic replication plugin for database servers. I probably should focus on the fact that it's become a lot more generic. I think people reading the source code have realized that it has become more generic. It's not just a MySQL replication plugin. It could theoretically be plugged into multiple other database front ends. It uses a replication API to interact with the database itself via the write set replication API. The project is fully open source. It's GPL licensed. It's available on GitHub. And the database and the Galera plugin must obviously have the same write set replication version. In the MySQL world, there tend to be 3 forms of replication that people can be familiar with. Asynchronous replication is the most common, in where you insert into your primary and you may have 3 secondary replicas, and they may not necessarily get a transaction said commit. So if the master goes away, you may lose transaction until the master comes back again. It's extremely fast. And typically it works with some kind of automatic failover framework. Now, you can use that with the MySQL utilities, MySQL failover. You could use it with MHA. You could use it with Orchestrator. There's also semi-synchronous replication, where in the MySQL world, it is a plugin still in 8.0, but in the MariaDB world, it is built in, no longer a plugin. And you insert, and at least one secondary will actually receive said transaction. So if the primary does go down, at least one secondary has it. And then there's the virtually synchronous replication, which is basically what Galera offers. And to be fair, there's also something called group replication in MySQL 8 and 5.7 as well. And there should be talks about that as well. And that you more or less have all nodes containing the same data. There are obviously little differences with the way Galera and group replication work. Group replication has a multi-primary mode, So you can also run it in sort of like a master-slave setup. Galera doesn't have that mode, so you have to run a full cluster. But the idea of automatic failover is built in with a virtually synchronous cluster like, say, group replication or Galera. Whereas semi-synchronous still requires you to have some kind of framework. There is no upstream solution that says, hey, you can just do it easily. So it is multi-master application where you could read and write to any node. So it looks like one very large database with multiple entry points. Transactions are processed locally until commit time, and then it gets replicated across nodes through the cluster. So you obviously do have the ability to have automatic node provisioning. Well, it is automatic because you set it up in your my.cnf with the cluster addressers. It is virtually synchronous because once it's applied on the node, then it moves on to the other nodes as well. And that should ensure you don't have this problem of having stale slaves. Each node obviously has identical copy of the data. You should be able to read and write from any node, and there is automatic transaction conflict detection. In terms of replication, of course, a copy of the entire data set is available on all nodes, so maybe you don't find the benefit of adding more nodes, like you don't want to go through a 7 or 9 cluster situation. It is InnoDB only, so MySQL's default engine is InnoDB. MySQL upstream doesn't really have that many extra engines anyway. MariaDB has a ton of extra engines, MyRocks, TokiDB, etc., and they don't work with Galera. You have to use InnoDB. And of course, we also look at data consistency protections. You don't have reading stale data. You don't have unsafe data modifications. And Galera, of course, works across WANs and clouds, so that your nodes can also be on different continents. You can have end-to-end encryption. It's optimized for communication with least latency. So if you have multiple data centers, you can segment to say that 3 nodes are sitting in data center 1, 3 nodes in data center 2, and so forth. MariaDB Server, which comes with Galera Cluster, has over 12 million downloads. PaconeXDB clusters at last count has over 1.3 million downloads, more from galeracluster.com, and of course you can't count distribution downloads. So if you go and download a copy of Ubuntu, you can actually install PXE fairly easily. Cloud platforms also recommend Galera clusters, so if you happen to use OpenStack, check out its documentation. It tells you, hey, you could spin up Galera cluster for that. There are various industries, e-commerce, gaming being gambling, gaming being actual games, telcos, banks, SaaS, infrastructure as a service, PaaS platforms that have used it for over a decade. It won an award in 2014, so maybe consequently I think I won an award that year too, and maybe Lefred won the award at the same time. So that must have been an interesting year for us to all win awards. It's also included in a whole chunk of distributions. Now, you may be, anybody here use FreeBSD? Anybody heard of FreeBSD? Yes, okay. So the way Galera releases, it tends to favor MariaDB first before it then releases MySQL version. But the easiest way to take a look at the source for the right-side replication, even before it maybe hits GitHub, is to actually take a look at the FreeBSD distribution, because they have an extremely up-to-date ports version that syncs with MariaDB. So yeah, just to recap, you can add, delete nodes on the fly. It really does look like one big database. There should be no single point of failure. It uses quorum-based failure handling, which is why you need a minimum of 3 nodes. Typically, odd number nodes are better, obviously. It's a 100% multi-master cluster, and you don't need any framework for automatic failover. It does do topology-aware replication, so each transaction will be sent to the data center only once. So if you have 3 data centers with 9 nodes in total, 3 in each, you will only be replicating officially to 5 first, and then the others, they'll apply locally. It also can detect and automatically evict unreliable nodes. So if you have a flappy network, it won't be able to rejoin without manual intervention. It obviously has split vein recovery as well as management. And the maybe interesting thing about running replication, especially in the cloud, is you want to encrypt everything. Now, MySQL has made this easier in 8. I think by default, you actually have SSL. MariaDB still does not default to using SSL, but I highly recommend you do that because otherwise replication traffic is fairly plain text. There are upstream Galera cluster releases. They are supported for 5.5, 5.6, and 5.7, and Galera 4 will come for 8.0 and potentially even 5.7. There are also distributions. MariaDB Galera cluster ships with Galera 3 in 5.5 right up to 10.3, and in the recently released 10.4, there is Galera 4. Percona XDB cluster ships 5.5, 5.6, and 5.7 with Galera 3. They have a release of Galera 3 and 8.0 on GitHub, but they're not making the release because I believe they're waiting to also start integrating Galera 4 into PXE8. And maybe a few weeks ago, someone said that this is an impossible task, but this is not true. That is fear, uncertainty, and doubt. There will be a Percona XDB cluster 8.0 with Galera 4. There will be a MySQL 8.0 with Galera 4. This is not just something with MariaDB. There have been many major releases of Galera's library, right up till 3. The current version is 3.26. 25 write set replication API versions. Of course, the most current version now is API 26, which corresponds with Galera 4, but you literally only get that with the new MariaDB. And there are changes in the wsrep API that requires you to do a rolling upgrade. And you can do a rolling upgrade in MariaDB. We'll talk about that later. And when MySQL comes out, you should also be able to do the same. So first, if you want to try out Galera, the best way to do it is to go download MariaDB 10.4.6 GA. You can install a 3-node cluster fairly easily on, say, the AWS free tier. The other way to try it is to maybe get DB deployer with PXE, but that won't include Galera 4 yet. wsrep is also integrated into 10.4, and it had impacts on code, bug fixes, feature turnover that required a lot of reviews. And this generally took time, and which is why maybe not all the features of Galera 4 are inside of 10.4. MariaDB actually did include Galera cluster since 10.1 when it was first integrated, and it keeps on upgrading and getting better. So a few features that are available in Galera cluster for MariaDB Server 10.4. Streaming replication, where I have a couple of slides for it. So you actually do have the ability to have larger transactions. It does work with group commit now as well. And MariaDB has implemented backup locks. And they have forked extra backup, and they call it Mariabackup. And you can now do Mariabackup state snapshot transfers with a lightweight backup lock. Backup locks was a feature that was around in Percona server for some time. It was in their InnoDB called ExtraDB, but MariaDB chose to go back to using InnoDB, and now they've implemented backup locks. So streaming replication is the base for supporting huge transactions. Basically, in Galera 3, a transaction would process on the master node until it was time to commit. And for very large transactions, the write sets will become very large because nodes process write sets in a single memory resident buffer. And it becomes fairly hard to process, so you actually could set this with a setting called wsrep max ws size to prevent large transactions. So streaming replication, of course, is new to enable running transactions of unlimited, i.e. larger size. You can, of course, still reject a large transaction. Sometimes people wonder what a large transaction is. It could be a load data in file. It could be a long-running transaction. And typically you have wsrep max ws rows and wsrep max ws size to limit the rows anywhere between 128 kilobytes to a gigabyte. And wx max ws size has a upper limit of 2 gigabytes, beyond which Galera itself will reject if you set this larger. There is a guide to handle large transactions that also makes use of using PT Archiver from Percona Toolkit. Does anybody here use Percona Toolkit? Heard of Percona Toolkit? I don't know if there are talks about it, but I highly recommend you go to one or learn this toolkit. And there's also a practical test on the Percona blog a while ago about how large your Galera transactions can be against Galera 3. So let's go back to streaming replication. Your transactions are replicated gradually in small fragments during transaction processing, so you can consider this to be some kind of transaction fragmentation, because before the actual commit, Galera will actually replicate a small number of sized fragments. You can configure the fragment replication size, of course. The replicated fragments are applied in slave threads. It'll also preserve the transaction state across all cluster nodes. And streaming replication will allow the nodes to process write stats that are greater than 2 gigabytes. So, of course, no one's tested what MariaDB 10.4 can do because it literally got GA'd yesterday. But you could, in early release candidates, we were going for 4 gigabyte low data in files, and this was also fine. You can dynamically configure streaming replication using the session variables wsrep transaction fragment unit as well as the fragment size. And this can be, you can just throw a statement that has unit metrics for the fragments, the options that are bytes, rows, as well as statements. And by default, of course, wsrep transaction fragment size can be 0, which means you actually don't use streaming replication. Naturally, streaming replication will cause degraded performance around throughput because it has a lot more logging as well as replication overhead. You may want to cut large transactions, and that's when you end up using streaming replication. Typically, again, we've done some tests to show that the fragment size around 10,000 rows makes sense. And applications, if you are willing to change the application code, can also set the streaming replication to on and off on a need-by-need basis. Now, if you happen to use MariaDB, there are some write-set replication information schema tables. But naturally, we also need to make sure we work well with MySQL. So there are a couple of new wsrep tables in the MySQL database. So they are the wsrep cluster, cluster members, as well as streaming log. wsrep cluster basically contains the current cluster view, some identity information of said cluster, and the capabilities of the cluster. So the cluster UUID contains the UUID of the cluster. The view ID corresponds to the status variables of the write-set replication cluster configuration ID. The number of cluster configuration changes which have occurred in the cluster. The view sequence number corresponds to the Galera sequence number associated with the cluster view. The protocol version is the same value as you get in wsrep protocol. Keep in mind that you never want to have mixed protocols because that would cause errors. In fact, it can break quite painfully. Protocol version, the MySQL wsrep or the MariaDB wsrep patch, obviously. And the capabilities column contains capabilities bit mask provided by the Galera library. It's basically metadata to recover node state during crash recovery. There is also wsrep cluster members, in where you can see the results of the cluster that is composed here of 3 nodes. Node UIDs are unique, of course, for each node. And you also get configuration with the wsrep node name parameter. Incoming node address is, of course, set to being auto on all nodes. But they can also be set to individual specific nodes by specifying the wsrep node address or the bind address inside of each node's configuration file. There's also wsrep streaming log, so the third of the new tables inside of the MySQL database. Typically, you will not see any results in it because it only contains entries for transactions which are streaming replication enabled. So unless you turn on streaming replication, this should return nothing. There are a handful of write-set replication functions for you to use. wsrep last seen GTID, which will return the global transaction ID for the last written transaction that is observed by the client. wsrep last written GTID, which returns the global transaction ID of the last write transaction made by the client, as well as wsrep sync wait up to GTID, which will block the client until the node applies and commits the given transaction. This has been implemented for quite some time as functions, but have not been in any shipping release until the Galera 4 that you see in MariaDB 10.4. Most people would want to upgrade via a rolling upgrade, and this should be relatively painless process. Basically, you have an existing 3-node Galera cluster. You isolate one node, so we take away maybe node 1, make that read-only. So you still have your 2-node cluster running for read-write. You shut down that server, you upgrade to MariaDB Server 10.4. You start the server without the write-set replication provider so that it doesn't pretend to be a new node. You got to run MySQL upgrade, shut down the server, restart it with the write-set replication provider option. Then you can allow read-only access. Then you update the second node, and you shut down node 1, allow read-write access again. That makes the node 1 upgrade complete. This is not an automated situation, and you got to repeat this again for node 3. Now the MariaDB documentation and knowledge base does recommend a dump and restore during the release candidate phase. But now that it's GA, rolling upgrade is fully supported. I guess the documentation will be updated in a couple of days. Some people have asked, can you upgrade from MariaDB Server 10.1 to 10.4 or 10.2 to 10.4? And this is definitely not a tested, recommended rolling upgrade path because there are obviously a ton of changes. So you should be moving from 10.3. How many people use MariaDB 10.3? Okay, reasonable number. And similarly, when MySQL 8 version comes out, you'll do a rolling upgrade from 5.7 to 8. So the Galera Cluster 4 roadmap today is such that only parts of Galera Cluster are actually merged into MariaDB Server 10.4. It turns out that there are a lot more features that are going to make its way into the MySQL version as well. Because it didn't make the MariaDB 10.4 review cutoff, so while the features are ready, the review is not. So those are features that are likely to be pushed into 10.5. So when you see the MySQL 8 version of Galera 4 come out, you will realize that it has a few other features, like the ability to encrypt the gcache, the ability to have a little bit of XA transaction support. And the idea here is to have it for a sharding cluster. XA transaction support is important, probably more important in the MariaDB world, so it can tie in with things like Spider, which MariaDB also happens to own now. It also will have the ability to have non-blocking DDL. It also needs to coincide with some other MariaDB non-blocking DDL work. But MySQL 8 also has non-blocking DDL work, so that's another reason why it was easier to merge into MySQL 8. And cluster error voting, which is actually not in the server, but inside of the Galera cluster library itself. It may make it into another 10.4 release. But I guess MariaDB is going for more rapid releases now. 10.5 has already been started. So today, with regards to the gcache, if you run, you want to have full data at rest encryption, the gcache is not encrypted. You actually are able to encrypt the DB table space, the redo log, the binary log, but the gcache has been the one sticking point, and the gcache encryption is ready inside a Galera 4. Non-blocking DDL. Lots of people totally want this because if you run a shared hosting environment, you put like, I don't know, 200 hosts on one Galera cluster, and then one of them says, hey, it's time to upgrade WordPress. Every time you want to run WP upgrade, it starts locking all writes on the database served by that cluster. So it could be quite annoying to do upgrades for those 200 users if they're all WordPress. But shared hosting, you don't have control if they're all WordPress. They could be Drupal, they could be Magento. So non-blocking DDL is a feature that is available in Galera 4, not in the MariaDB release, but it will be in the MySQL 8 release. So naturally, because MariaDB was working on 10.5 also in parallel, there is work on MariaDB Server 10.5. Galera Cluster is actually integrated already to 5.6 and 5.7, but it turns out that a small team of less than 20 people are finding it probably going to be a maintenance nightmare to release such parallel releases and maintain it over a 5-year period. So what you will see in a short period of time is Galera Cluster 4 with MySQL 8. Typically, after a short delay after the MariaDB Server 10.4 is GA. So we are approaching summer now. One could assume that it comes towards the end of summer. We may be able to provide a 5.7 release based on customer requests, but overall, we're thinking of just Galera 4 with MySQL 8. So there are a lot of features in Galera that are not necessarily usable until the MySQL 8 release comes out in a couple months, but the MariaDB Server 10.4 one already has significant new changes. Streaming replication definitely implements the new replication protocol, can do other new interesting features. That's where we'll also throw in some of the XA functionality. More features are of course expected in MariaDB Server 10.4, even as it's already released. Rolling cluster upgrade is supported, but it does require some care. And again, there will be a Galera cluster for MySQL 8. So, second last slide. There is a raffle. I think if you scan that QR code, you can win something. A pair of Bose noise-canceling headphones. I did not make this slide, so hopefully the QR code works. There is a booth. Go speak to Vlad. He may be here or not. And yeah, with that, I end on time, actually. It's 3 minutes before we're over. Thank you.